Hi, this is Jim Musser with Upstream Ministries, and this is episode 76 on Views from Downstream. And we've been spending the last few weeks talking about the worship service. And I want to focus today on the idea of worship through music. And I had a series that I did many years ago among my campus ministry students entitled What You Learned in Church That You Shouldn't Have. And one of the weeks that I shared, it was on music equals worship. And a long time ago, I noticed that many Christians equate worship with singing songs. And I think that's one of the reasons why in the modern church so much emphasis and time is put into singing songs. But the reality is that worship is much more than singing songs. In fact, the prophet Amos in chapter 5, and I'm going to read this from my phone here. God saying, I despise your religious festivals. Your assemblies are a stench to me. Even though you bring me burnt offerings and grain offerings, I will not accept them. Though you bring choice fellowship offerings, I will have no regard for them. Away with the noise of your songs. I will not listen to the music of your harps, but let justice roll on like a river, righteousness like a never-failing stream. Now listen to that. Away with your songs, away with your offerings. And I think what Amos was warning us about, and God through Amos, was that it's very easy, as the Israelites experience and did, and we in today's culture do, we think if we do the right things, then we're good with God. And or if we're attending a church service and we're singing out to God and raising our hands or whatever we do to express our praise for God, that somehow He is very pleased with that. But I think, and this is what I want to emphasize, if we think that our demonstration of worship of God is limited exclusively to singing songs, then we have missed most of what worship is. And worship is really, as Paul says in Colossians 3:23, whatever you do, work at it with all your heart as working for the Lord, not for human masters. We do everything for the Lord. That is worship. We worship God through how we treat people. We worship God in what we think and our attitudes. We worship God through ministering to others, through being generous, through being kind, through being loving. But the problem is, in our church, we even in our language say, and I've heard pastors say this over and over, oh, wasn't that a great time of worship? Well, maybe, but what it's communicating is that that's worship. Exclusively, that's worship. That is singing songs. So we come to the church service and our worship starts with the music and ends with the music, and then the rest of it, while we're listening to a sermon. Have we ever thought about listening to a sermon and interacting with it as worship? Have we thought about the way we engage people in our congregations, how we mix with them on Sunday morning is worship? Whether we, it's a revelation of how we worship, whether we engage people or we ignore people. I know I have been in churches where people will not make eye contact with me, will be walking a hallway where it's only the two of us and they will not acknowledge me. And I question then, okay, is that how you worshiping God in that moment? Because when we treat each other as God's creatures, we're worshiping God. And when we don't, in reality, we're not worshiping Him. We're focused on ourselves. And so I just want to emphasize that we need to have a broader perspective of what worship is. And part of the problem with our worship services is that we've just basically contained worship into a 20, 30-minute segment, and we've solely defined it as that. And people have this understanding that that's worship. And then, as you know, as my struggles with worship services overall is that if that's all we're doing, then people go out and they live their lives the way they want to. And they aren't living them often in a worshipful way with God on their mind and present in how they're behaving and how they're thinking. They're just living life because, in essence, worship is only 30 minutes on Sunday morning, and yeah, I give it my all. But listen to what God says through Amos. Away with your songs, away with your music. And why? Because your life doesn't reflect who I am. There's no justice in how you treat people. You're treating people poorly, you're oppressing them, you're enslaving them, you're not giving to them when they're in need. And so when the modern church gets, in a sense, a prideful attitude, yeah, we've got great worship. The question is, okay, does that worship extend beyond the music, the singing of psalms? Does it extend to how you treat people in your own congregation? Does that extend to how you treat and interact with people in your neighborhood or at work? Because we are to do everything as if we're doing it for the Lord. That is worship. And so I just want to challenge you, and leaders in particularly, can we begin to emphasize, just for the sake of people fully understanding, that worship is not merely singing songs. It is not just the music. It is our everyday lives. We worship God daily in our lives by how we conduct ourselves, how we live out our lives. And that's what God wants. There's nothing wrong with singing songs to God and praising Him in that way. But if we have the understanding that this is the entirety of worship, then we have missed really the biblical meaning of worship. That we give everything of our lives to the Lord and we live our lives out as if we are living for the Lord. That is true worship. I'll leave it there. Something to think about. And when you go to church on this next Sunday, and when they talk about, let's worship, keep in mind, again, that there's more to worship than just singing those songs. It's about how you live your life. Have a great day, and we'll see you next week.